Tonight's special guest speaker, Dr. Spencer Fire, is a biological oceanographer and associate professor of biological sciences at Florida Institute of Technology up the road in Melbourne. Dr. Fire holds a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University and a master's degree and PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Much of Dr. Fire's work is focused on the impacts of harmful algal blooms on marine food webs and on the health of key species, including marine mammals. So tonight, Dr. Fire is going to be telling us all about that work. Please join me as I welcome Dr. Fire to the stage.
Well, thank you for that introduction. It's nice to be here with such a large and lovely group. Thank you for having me. This is a pleasure. I'm just getting over a little bit of a chest cold, so I hope you'll forgive me. Is it going to be the most aesthetically pleasing talk, listening to my voice? No, but are you going to learn more about this subject than you will ever learn in your entire life? Also no. But I'm gonna do my best to give you a sense of what I do, why I'm interested in sort of these two fields that are, at first glance, kind of unrelated, and the type of work we've been doing for the last several years. So I was hoping that I was able to correctly guess my demographic, because I showed this slide to my students at Florida Tech, and they had no idea what this was from that old Desinex commercial or Dinerex commercial. Anyway. Like Zach said, I'm going to be talking about sort of the intersection between harmful algal blooms, a completely natural phenomenon, and marine mammals, why we care about them in this context. There's lots of reasons why we care about marine mammals, but hopefully this will give you a sense for what's happening in our backyards in the Indian River Lagoon and along the Atlantic coast here in Florida. So we'll start off with the basics, right? So I'm not going to assume anyone knows anything about science. I know a lot of us are here are lay folks who have an interest in science. So what is an algal bloom? So an algal bloom is just any rapid growth or really rapid accumulation of phytoplankton, right? So if you have ever seen pictures like this here on the top left, that's a algal bloom with probably something that looks like microcystis. You guys probably are familiar with that big, gross green bloom that we had here in 2016 that Lake Okeechobee gave us. That is one type of algal bloom. If you ever, like me, neglected your pool for several weeks at a time, that's also an algal bloom, right? So any sort of rapid growth of phytoplankton living in any aquatic environment will count as an algal bloom. So what are phytoplankton, right? So going back a step, phytoplankton, for our purposes, they're generally little tiny plant-like critters, right? So they're microscopic. They are photosynthetic critters, so they need the sun in order to produce carbohydrates and all the other stuff that we rely on them for. We call them plant-like because they're not actual true plants. That's a completely separate part of the tree of life. But they're plant-like because they use sunlight and to generate organic molecules. They're generally protists or cyanobacteria, if you care about that sort of thing. So things that aren't plants or animals, it's sort of this small microscopic in-between sort of thing. We typically call them sloppily algae or microalgae, just because it's easier than going through the whole spiel about what are they not. They generally concentrate at the surface because that's where the sunlight is most abundant. So typically the ones that we have in our neck of the woods, they're diatoms, which are the circular guys, and the pen-shaped ones. Dinoflagellates can have all kinds of different shapes, but those are typically the two usual suspects that form phytoplankton communities. If you don't know what plants are, come see me afterwards. I'll walk you through that part. So what makes a harmful algal bloom harmful, all right? So not all algal blooms are harmful. In fact, only a very small percentage of algal blooms are harmful. So you can think of algal blooms as sort of the base of the marine food web, right? If you go out into the countryside and you see cows grazing on grass, plants, bushes, that's all the base of the terrestrial food web. Phytoplankton, algal blooms, same thing, but in the aquatic environment. So harmful algal blooms is basically just anything that we don't like, right? So an HAB, a harmful algal bloom, there's lots of reasons to call it harmful. We're the only ones in the tree of life that goes around naming things and categorizing things. So we get to decide, I guess, because we have opposable thumbs. We get to decide what's harmful and what's not. So it's basically anything that's bad. What is your definition of bad? It depends on where you are and what the context is. Sometimes it's because you have toxins in the food web. Sometimes it makes it smell really bad. Sometimes it makes you cough. Sometimes it just looks super gross, right? Like fish on your beach. So what is a harmful algal bloom? Well, I'll tell you what it's not. Harmful algal blooms are algal blooms that occur in any region. It can be in aquatic environments, freshwater environments, marine environments. Harmful algal blooms have for a long time been called red tides. That's kind of the common name for referring to these. If you're super pedantic, like me and my colleagues, you'll go, well, actually, they're not really supposed to be called red tides because they're very rarely red. Sometimes they can be green or brown or yellow or orange, depending on the color of the chloroplast, the chlorophyll they have inside their little bodies. They're actually unrelated to the tides. So just for sake of clarity, we call them HABs or HABs or harmful algal blooms. Red tide, you guys can use red tide all you want. I'm just saying. If you ever go to a meeting, they're gonna give you the stink eye if you call it a red tide. So one of the first questions I usually get asked is, all right, we're having a red tide. Who's responsible? All right, well, so we're gonna go over just some of the basic things that can cause or at least contribute to the formation or upkeep of a HAB or HAB. So since these are, again, photosynthetic critters, they're plant-like organisms, much of the same things that any plant needs in order to survive and to grow and be healthy and to thrive, these are also the same things that a harmful algal bloom needs to grow and to thrive and be successful. So anything that causes plants to grow, it's a pretty safe bet it's also going to contribute to harmful algal bloom growth. So if you're like our friend Harold here, Harold's got a plant, what he wants to do to make it healthy and pretty, he's gonna give it water, right? So water, under certain conditions, you can't give it hot water, you can't give it cold water. Water at it's sort of a specific temperature range. It needs carbon dioxide, right? Photosynthesis needs carbon dioxide to turn into oxygen. There's plenty of that, so you just put it outside in your window, right? Your plant is happy if it's got water and CO2. You also put it where the sun can reach it, right? So a lot of these plant-like critters need certain amounts of sun. Sometimes you can have too much, sometimes you can have too little. So we're talking about optimal light levels causes optimal growth, faster growth. So anywhere they can access the sunlight, that's generally a good thing. They also like a specific type of temperature. All different algal bloom species have their favorite temperature range. Like some of us are from Florida and we like it when it's 85 degrees inside our house, and some of us are from Michigan and we like it when it's 60 degrees and everyone else has to wear a sweater, right? So we all have different types of favorite optimal temperature ranges, and under those conditions they can grow and thrive and have optimal growth. Nutrients, right? So you give your plant food, you water it, you give it air, but also sometimes it needs a little bit of a boost to make sure it grows healthily. So we call these things just in a big sloppy category called nutrients. Nutrients, you give them, it grows faster. Biomass is just the size, the amount of the weight of the plant matter. So more nutrients, optimal nutrients means more biomass. No one ever tells you what the nutrients are. So most plants, they're made out of carbs, right? You eat your plants, eat your salad, your veggies, those are all carbs. Carbs is carbon molecules, hydrogen atoms, and oxygen, right? So that's super abundant, right? The oxygen comes from the water that we give it. Hydrogen also comes from the water that we give it. Oxygen also comes from the CO2 that we give it. Carbon comes from the CO2. Those things are in abundance. There's no running out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen if you're a plant. What you can run out of are what we call limiting nutrients or micronutrients, and that's typically the atoms nitrogen and phosphorus, right? So when people usually talk about being eutrophic or eutrophication or over nutrient supply, they're usually talking about nitrogen and phosphorus, which is limiting nutrients. So everything else is abundance, but if you give you that little extra boost of nitrogen and phosphorus, then they can really grow out of control if they have the right circumstances. And other types of minerals that we get in our sort of like multivitamins for harmful algae. Sometimes they need zinc, sometimes they need copper, other trace metals that can also be very specific towards specific type of species. They also have their favorite salinity ranges. Some of them can do great in fresh water. Some of them can prefer marine water. Some of them can live in brackish water. Sometimes they like different types of water stability. Sometimes they like a really calm and windless lagoon where it's very shallow and very stable. Sometimes they like a lot of movement and turnover and windy conditions like we see offshore and rockier environments. They have specific pH ranges. There's all kinds of other things that sort of like us individually. We all have our favorite environmental conditions under which we feel the most comfortable. All right, so taking all that into consideration, how do we get a harmful algal bloom? To answer the question is whichever one of those species out of this entire phytoplankton community in any region, whichever one of those is able to successfully compete or specifically outcompete their neighbors for all these resources can grow the fastest, and they tend to dominate the rest of the phytoplankton community, and they look like that whole entire algal bloom is made of that single species that's doing really well under those circumstances. So that's generally the recipe for what causes any algal bloom, and what causes a harmful algal bloom is if that species also tends to be one that we don't like. So another question I will typically get asked is, did we cause this harmful algal bloom? Was it the oil industry, or was it drilling offshore, or was it Obama? Somebody's always to blame for causing a harmful algal bloom. Believe it or not, the vast majority of harmful algal blooms are completely natural phenomenon. In fact, we have historical accounts going back several hundred years documenting natural phenomenon that are pretty easily identifiable as harmful algal blooms. For example, Spanish explorer and guy who's trying to figure out what that smell is, Cabeza de Vaca, was one of the first explorers to explore the Gulf of Mexico, including Texas. And what he noticed was in certain times of the year, there was a smell that could barely be tolerated from the ocean. The water turned color, the fish would die. It was just a generally unpleasant experience. And that was in the 1500s, completely natural phenomenon. I don't know if you know this about the harmful algal bloom community. This is our big claim to fame. Like, we've been studying things that have been going on since biblical times, and so we're very insecure. We need constant validation, so we always refer to this as our claim to fame. I don't know if you guys remember this movie, The Ten Commandments. Like, behold the power of the Lord, right? So that whole rivers turn to blood, that's also very similar to what can happen in a harmful algal bloom. The rivers can smell, they give off an odor, fish die, it can change color. All those things, we don't know if it really happened or not. Anyway. So to answer the question, there are some cases in which harmful algal blooms can in fact be very obviously caused by human interference, human involvement in the coastal oceans, human coastal change. So the answer is sometimes, especially when you take those limiting nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and you dump huge quantities of them into the ocean, releasing that pressure, releasing that competition where they're not all trying to scavenge as much nitrogen and phosphorus as they can, we're giving it to them abundantly so they have no room but to just keep growing out of control. So a couple of really good examples of this that are kind of my favorite examples are one from Samoa. I don't know, this is probably mid-2000s maybe. There was the way the story goes, I'm only getting this secondhand. There was some big international soccer championship that was supposed to happen in Samoa. Samoa was hosting a soccer championship, and so they decided to build a big brand new shiny stadium. And so they build the soccer stadium, and they're trying to get the grass to grow, but it just won't grow. And the people are breathing down their necks because the deadline, all the fans are going to start showing up in a couple weeks. So we really need this grass to grow. I really can't stress this enough. What can we do? It's like, well, I guess we could just pour a ton of fertilizer on it. So that's what they did. Beautiful grass. They had a great time, but obviously, I don't know if you guys are familiar with where Samoa is, the tropical Pacific, lots and lots of rain. So what happens when you have a ton of rain, washing all that fertilizer off into a very small island in a little teeny tiny harbor? Well, you get a ton of nutrients, releasing that limiting pressure from all the phytoplankton that were in Pago Pago Harbor, and then you get the nice pristine blue clear waters that you see in the top right turn into sort of a murky reddish brown goopy mess that you see in the bottom right photo. You can also get increases in nutrient concentration just with normal human activities if those human activities increase with more people moving into a particular area. So for example, in one of the main metropolitan areas in Hong Kong, Tolo Harbor, over about 10 or 11 years, they had probably a 4 or 5-fold increase in the amount of people living in that region. So people use soap. Soap has phosphorus in it. People water their lawns. Lawns have nitrogen and phosphorus in them. So this huge amount of nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients for these plants, plant food basically, gets dumped into this harbor over several years. And what you see is an increase in the frequency and the severity of harmful algal blooms just in this one area, just as a direct result of increases in human population. Okay, so what makes a harmful algal bloom harmful? Like I said before, you can't really pin it down to one particular thing. It's, if you don't like it, then sure, it's a harmful algal bloom. So there's lots of different ways a harmful algal bloom can be harmful, so I'll just kind of touch on some of those briefly. One of them that we see, if any of you are familiar with aquaculture, if you're raising in particular a fish farm, so you have a bunch of fish highly concentrated in a small volume of water, usually in a pen. What you have is sometimes you can have phytoplankton. This particular phytoplankton on the top left is called a diatom. It's made out of glass. It has a silica dioxide, which is glass. Frustule is sort of an outside shell. Sometimes that frustule, that shell, can have long, pokey little spines on it, all right? So which aren't necessarily bad unless you're a fish. You can see the serrations on some of these long spines. So sometimes fish will graze on phytoplankton. Sometimes it can just pass through their gills. So this is on the bottom right, this is a photo of the gill tissue of a fish. So you know how sensitive our nose and nasal airways and lungs are to any sort of mechanical irritation, right? So that's the similar structure for getting oxygen out of the water for fish. The same way that our lungs are very sensitive, that little pink tissue, that's the gill tissue of the fish, which is how they extract oxygen from the water and get it into their bloodstream. However, when you have a bunch of little pokey little glass shards going across that very sensitive tissue, what the response is, the same way that when our respiratory airways get irritated, we start to produce mucus. Same thing happens in fish gill tissue. When they get irritated from mechanical damage, all these little pokey little spines, they also produce mucus. What should be a normal defense mechanism, you can actually produce too much mucus to the point where you can no longer absorb oxygen into those gills, no longer get oxygen from the seawater into your blood because there's too much snot in the way. So one of the ways that harmful algal blooms can be harmful is just through mechanical damage, which causes a normal physiological defense response, which unfortunately causes them to die from lack of oxygen. This is kind of a one-off. This is an interesting phenomenon that happened off the coast of Washington, probably about 10, 15 years ago. So certain species like this guy in the top left, Akashiwo sanguinea, is a type of dinoflagellate, a type of phytoplankton that for one reason or another produces chemicals that get into the seawater that acts as kind of like a soap or a detergent. You guys are familiar with soaps and detergents. They tend to emulsify and cause bubbles. What makes soap good, or what makes a detergent really good, is it can dissolve in water. It can also dissolve in fats and lipids. That's just the way it gets grease off of your dishes, right? So this is great if you're washing dishes, but not so great if you're a seabird. So seabirds, I don't know if you've ever seen seabirds out on the Pacific coast. They tend to spend a lot of time sitting on the water, preening themselves, cleaning. So they're in contact with seawater. So seabirds are small. They are warm-blooded creatures, so it's very, very important for a seabird to stay warm. And it's hard to stay warm if you've got super cold seawater leaching all that heat out of your body. So what they do is they have oil glands that coat their feathers. That's why they're constantly preening. They're smoothing out that feather coat, making it that nice oily structure be able to trap air like a wetsuit. Has anyone ever dive with a neoprene wetsuit? You ever seen like the little bubbles that are built into a neoprene wetsuit? Same concept, right? So that layer of air that's trapped underneath the feathers and in between the skin acts as a nice insulative buffer. However, detergents take oil and strip it away using water. So this is basically what happens if you get a harmful algal bloom that's made of a species that's basically just producing soap. It washes away all those nice, helpful lipids and fats that coat the feathers and allow this cold seawater to touch the skin of the birds, causing them to die from hypothermia. So that was kind of a we don't see that too often, but it was an interesting first for us. Other ways that harmful algal blooms can be harmful, especially if you're from the region of the northern Gulf of Mexico, you're probably familiar with this, is just through their normal physiology. They grow, they get bigger, and they die. So what usually happens is you have a lot of nutrients being introduced into the marine environment. A harmful algal bloom will grow big. You get lots and lots of biomass. So I'm ashamed to admit I didn't realize this till I was actually in college. Just because you're an oxygen producer doesn't mean that you're not also an oxygen consumer. So sometimes as a kid we think, well, these plants produce oxygen. They don't need oxygen. Of course they do. Every living thing needs oxygen. So if you're a big, giant, harmful algal bloom producing oxygen, that's great until the sun goes down. Then when the sun goes down, now you're an oxygen consumer. So you have this giant biomass that's pulling oxygen out of the water, along with all the other non-photosynthetic critters that are also pulling oxygen out of the water. And then on top of that, you have the cells undergoing their normal life cycle and dying. So now you have a third component, a bunch of dying, decomposing cells, and the bacteria that feed on those are also sucking oxygen out of the water. So what happens is between the time that the sun goes down and the time that the sun comes up, you've had a huge amount of oxygen consumers sucking all that dissolved oxygen out of the water, so much so that anything else that needs oxygen to survive dies by morning time. So we call these anoxic zones if the water is completely stripped of oxygen, or sometimes they're called hypoxic zones if they're mostly stripped of oxygen. The end result is the same as organisms suffocate. They can't have enough oxygen to survive. So we get these big phenomenon called dead zones, depending on how much of this nutrient-rich water is flooding this marine system. You can have lots and lots of organisms over a very wide area being dead by morning. It's not just a great Christopher Walken movie, it's also a super interesting phenomenon. Wow. The dead zones, this is fantastic. So this is something we see in the outflow of the Mississippi River. So if you've ever seen the Mississippi River watershed, it takes up fully a third or a half of the United States. That all of that nutrients, all those fertilizers, all of that farmland and agricultural land, it's all funneling down into the coast of Louisiana. So you have tons and tons, a third of the size of the United States worth of nitrogen and phosphorus being dumped into this small area in the northern Gulf of Mexico. You get a huge dead zone. This is almost a permanent dead zone. So year round, you're getting very low, if not completely zero dissolved oxygen in these regions, which makes it really hard to grow and thrive if you're an underwater critter that relies on oxygen. All right, other ways that harmful algal blooms can be harmful. So for example, here on the top left, that, believe it or not, is the Indian River Lagoon with great water quality. This is what it used to look like several years ago. Under those conditions, you have other primary producers, other photosynthetic organisms like seagrass and macroalgae that live under the water. Big plant-like critters that still rely on sunlight to be able to photosynthesize, reproduce, and live happy lives. However, when you get a big harmful algal bloom that collects and concentrates near the surface, sometimes the biomass of that harmful algal bloom can be so dense that can actually block the sunlight. It can shade that entire marine environment. So those poor seagrasses on the bottom that are only left with the scraps of sunlight that come down, they don't get enough to be able to survive. And so you get loss of huge amounts of seagrass beds. This is something that happened, I think, in probably about 10 years ago now. We had, you guys remember the super bloom? Everyone kept talking about the super bloom. So the super bloom was a Texas brown tide organism, Ario umbra, on the top right there. So because of the amount of shading just the presence of that algal bloom was there. It wasn't toxic in any way, it wasn't harmful to other organisms, it just blocked the sun. So you get loss of, I think it was upwards of 50% of the seagrass beds in most of the Indian River Lagoon. And all the organisms that rely on seagrasses for habitat for food were also lost or extirpated during that time. So lots of ways you can be harmful. Sometimes it just looks nasty. So I don't know if you guys remember what year was that? They had the Olympics in China, maybe 2008 maybe? I wasn't there. Anyway, so you guys remember that Olympics. I don't know if you remember or not, but there were several water-based events that they had to cancel or postpone because of this giant green, goopy, harmful algal bloom that took place in the regions where they were going to be having events. So what they ended up doing is just hiring local folks to go out there and just grab armfuls of the stuff and just kind of like plopping onto the beach. So yeah, that certainly does look gross. If you're, for example, an example more close to home, if you live in Sarasota, for example, and you've got a giant McMansion on the beach and you're trying to sell it to someone from Michigan, no one's going to want to buy your house if they know that there's always dead fish on your beach, all right? So sometimes it just makes the water look gross. It can definitely have a very tangible impact on people wanting to come to your state to visit if they know there's going to be a big nasty bloom there. So it affects tourism, it affects their property value if you're trying to resell, which results in a very tangible economic loss to a large population of humans. So that is definitely harmful, at least from a human standpoint. Okay, so which brings me to my interest. The type of harmful algae that I'm interested in are harmful because they produce chemicals that are necessary for their own normal metabolism that for one reason or another happen to be harmful to some other critter in their food web or in their environment. So typically we call these biotoxins, right? A toxin is something that doesn't belong in the body of one organism. It may be caused by the body of another organism, in which case it's a natural toxin. So these are completely natural precursors to molecules that are necessary to survive, but for one reason or another, other critters around them don't like it. In most cases, the harmful algal toxins that are of concern are either neurotoxins, which affect the way that our neurons communicate with each other, so nerves and brains, or they're liver toxins, like the one we have closer to here coming out of Lake Okeechobee, which is a hepatotoxin, so it affects how your liver metabolizes sugars and energy and regulates other kinds of hormones. The result is the same. You're going to have illness. You're going to have disease. In severe cases, that can actually result in death. So there are as many different types of harmful toxin molecules as there are species that produce them. So there is a wider variety, but I will be talking about the few that are relevant to us as Florida citizens. The reason that we even care about this in the first place is because the illnesses that can be caused from HAB toxins they're not really much of a problem now, but they have been the driver for the harmful algal bloom research community. So there's a number of different types of human illnesses that are caused by harmful algal bloom toxins, and it depends on which toxin they're produces a different number of symptoms. For example, if you go to a shellfish bed in the central West Florida coast and harvest some unlicensed shellfish and eat them, you may be at risk for neurotoxic shellfish poisoning because that particular toxin causes neurotoxicity, and messes with the way your neurons talk to each other. On the West Coast, they have one that produces, in some cases, can actually lead to memory loss as well as other neurological deficits. We call that amnesic shellfish poisoning because you don't have as great short-term memory after you've been infected with it. Ciguatera fish poisoning, if you've ever been to the Caribbean or the South Pacific and you're warned not to eat barracuda or grouper or other large predatory fish, this is the one they're trying to warn you about, ciguatera fish poisoning, also pretty common in Puerto Rico and Cuba. Paralytic shellfish poisoning, if you're from the New England area, this is why they close the shellfish bed sometimes every couple of years, because that particular toxin causes paralysis. And then diuretic shellfish poisoning causes gastrointestinal distress. So there are a number of different toxins that do affect humans through seafood with a number of different associated human illnesses. So in severe cases, we're usually, as humans, getting exposed to this through seafood, usually through bivalve shellfish, clams, mussels, scallops. What's the other one? Oysters. So for coastal environments like this, we are relying heavily on shellfish, although I'm pretty sure science hasn't been able to answer the question of why people eat shellfish because they are objectively gross. But for those of you who do like shellfish, this is the primary route through which we are getting intoxicated. In some cases, like the Great Lakes area, for example, sometimes it can actually be in drinking water. If you're in a freshwater environment and you have a freshwater harmful algal bloom, sometimes your source of drinking water can come from that freshwater body. So drinking water can sometimes be an issue. Another one that also comes from like Michigan, the Great Lakes area, recreational exposure. It's great. It's fun to go swimming during the summertime when you've been waiting all winter long to get out. Sometimes there is a harmful algal bloom waiting for you when you get to the beach of that particular lake. So just sometimes being exposed to that can be a risk to your health. Either you or your pets. Dogs don't know what they're doing. They tend to drink water wherever they find it. Has anyone been to, I think we had one here maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, been to the beach during a Florida red tide? I mean, right, by the raise of hands, you guys ever felt what were your symptoms? Just yell them out. What were your... Coughing, burning, right? It just makes your eyes feel all watery and burny, nose and throat. Pretty gross, right? All right, so respiratory effects, that's something we get here closer to home. Our Florida version of red tide is a toxin that becomes airborne and it gets into your airways and can cause all kinds of other havoc with those. But those are all just the acute effects. Those are the ones we know about because they're easily identifiable between symptoms and going to get medical care or talking to someone. We really have no idea what the chronic, low-level, long-term impacts of any of these toxins are for the most part, which is why we treat this with caution whenever possible. So over the last several decades, which is really, that's only how long our field has been in existence, we've kind of seen an apparent increase in the amount of frequency of occurrence of harmful algal blooms, as well as the severity. So the top image is showing the number of events that were documented, human health impacts from harmful algal blooms in the 70s. And then 3.5 decades later, we notice a sort of an apparent increase in how much geography they're covering. A lot of this, however, is not an actual risk, just because, you know, after 30 years, we're going to have some pretty good tools to be able to look and detect and monitor. There's also more people looking. We have better methods and technology, so it's not all doom and gloom. But so we are better at it than we used to be, and we are more aware of it than we used to be. So I don't want anyone to run out of here screaming. What we have changed for the worse, though, that is easily documented, is how many people there are around, all fertilizing their lawns and using detergent and dumping those nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients into the marine environment. So we call that eutrophication. Right? Eutrophication just means overfeeding. All right, we're all kind of overfed as American citizens, right? We're doing the same thing to our marine environment, dumping all those nutrients that would otherwise be limiting and keeping those populations of algal blooms in check. Now they have free reign. Just imagine yourself at a buffet where there's no consequences, right? That's really what's happening to harmful algal blooms with all the food that we're giving them. We're also changing quite drastically and quite rapidly the marine ecosystems that we inhabit right now. So in terms of beach renourishment, coastal development, urban development, coastal runoff from all the hard concrete and streets we're putting down, those all have impacts that directly influence the frequency and severity of HABs in our coastal regions. I think it's upwards of maybe like 60% of the entire world's population lives within maybe 30 miles of the marine environment right now. And as well, climate change, we also know that's one that's a big looming effect that's going to be having more severe effects. We're also starting to see immediate effects from increases in temperature in certain regions of the coastal environments, where harmful algal blooms that would otherwise not been able to inhabit those waters, maybe because they were too cold, now they're warming up and they're starting to expand their ranges and live in places where they weren't a problem before and now could potentially become a problem. We also have, every time we order something from Amazon, it's probably coming from China somewhere, and it gets on a boat and it travels across the oceans to get to where we are. So global shipping, which is great, it's useful to get products from faraway places where we can't get them. However, the process of shipping means ships take in bajillions of gallons of water for ballast in one area of the world and then dump it off another bajillion gallons in the world when you get to their destination. So you're constantly re-inoculating different parts of the global oceans with potentially harmful algal bloom species that have never been there before, and the local community has no way to defend against that. So we have invasive species constantly being mixed around from oceans where they were never previously mixed. It can also have big changes in the grazing communities, the organisms that feed on phytoplankton that normally keep them in check. If we throw those ones out of balance, then we don't really have any natural ways to combat or reduce the amount of harmful algal blooms in that area. Okay, so I realized that marine mammals are in my talk, and you're probably wondering, like, okay, great, let's get to the dolphins. All right, so the reason we even care about marine mammals in the first place, there's lots of reasons to care about marine mammals. Look, I get that they're cute, but that's not why I study them. Is because they are what we call a marine sentinel species, or a sentinel organism, right? So you guys have heard of a sentinel is kind of like a guard or someone on the watchtower, right? So in the same sense, you guys have all heard the phrase, the canary in the coal mine. All right, for those of you who haven't, a long time ago when, this is a very low-tech method, a low-tech OSHA method that probably isn't in use now. So if you're a miner in West Virginia, you go down under the ground and you're mining coal, sometimes there's pockets of methane or other natural gases which are odorless, colorless, and super, super toxic. So what you do is you bring a little tiny canary, which is super sensitive, but likes to sing, in a cage, and you have it hanging out there while you're working. I'm sure this is what they do in a coal mine, right? So you're in a coal mine, banging away at the rocks, and if you get a pocket of methane, the first critter to die is going to be the canary. As soon as you hear that canary stop singing, then it's time to nope out of there. So the point being that something that can happen to a sensitive organism can be an early warning indicator to you as a human person, all right? So in that same sense, marine mammals are sentinel organisms of the health of the marine environment. So any sorts of health risks or hazards that are occurring and observable to marine mammals can be an early warning indicator, the same way as the canary is to us as humans. So hopefully we'll have enough time to correct or mitigate the problem before it becomes a big problem. So you've probably heard the phrase oceans and human health a lot of times before at this lecture series. So they are intricately connected. What happens to the health of the oceans is directly influenced and is influenced by what happens to human health and human environment. Okay, so the way that harmful algal blooms can get to us to start causing problems is because the natural toxins that are produced by these photosynthetic organisms can cause different types of pathology. So for example, they can be neurotoxic shellfish toxins, they can be amnesic shellfish toxins, or they can be, both of those sometimes can be fatal. Obviously diuretic shellfish toxins, that's not gonna kill you, but it's certainly gonna make for a super awkward cocktail party, right? So all these toxins that are being produced in large masses during a harmful algal bloom, they're all going to be concentrated by a grazing organism. So an organism that we call a filter feeder that draws in large volumes of water into its body to feed on these phytoplankton are also taking all those toxins that are in the seawater and concentrating them to such high concentrations in their tissues that they in turn become toxic to their predators, which sometimes can be humans or other apex predators. But fortunately for us as humans, we have lots and lots of really great federal and state-run early warning systems that are out there looking for toxins in the environment, making sure we don't just randomly eat whatever shellfish we find on the beach. Hey, look, I found a rock with a snot in it. So it keeps us from doing bad things and eating bad things when there's a harmful algal bloom. There's lots of folks in the state and federal systems that are looking out for us. They post signs on the beaches and anywhere that we could be getting intoxicated from these types of toxins. Marine mammals don't have any type of early warning system. There's no one going around knocking on their doors telling them, hey, you should probably not eat that thing today because there's a harmful algal bloom. So what's happening with marine mammals is they also have harmful algal bloom toxins in their food web, which are being concentrated by a grazing organism. We call that a vector organism, the one that concentrates it and now makes it available to higher trophic levels like marine mammals. That's usually what's happening to them, is the same thing that could be happening to us if we didn't have our early warning signs. Okay, so what is the consequence of that? Well, basically you have illness, and if the illness is severe enough, you can have die-offs. And the die-offs can also include multiple animals, and sometimes we call those large-scale mortality events. So if you actually look at the folks who are tracking this sort of thing, this is some data from NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, that tracks the cause of death for all these large-scale marine mammal die-offs over the last several decades. This is, again, 10 years old. I'm sorry for the antiquity of this slide. But if you look at all the different types of factors that can cause large-scale marine mammal events, and you take away the ones that don't have a known cause, what you're left with is the most common one, the one in red, biotoxins, right? The most common cause of death in a large-scale marine mammal die-off are harmful algal blooms and or their toxins. More so than viruses and bacterial outbreaks, more so than El Nino events, which would be ecological factors, more so than fishery entanglements and boat strikes. This is the big one for those that are interested in marine mammal conservation. So now that I've sufficiently scared everyone, which ones should you actually be concerned about? Hopefully the last half of the talk will be putting your minds at ease somewhat, that you'll be more educated. So the story kind of starts way off in the West Coast in this magical place called California. It's sort of the inception of the harmful algal bloom research field in itself. A place called Monterey Bay, where there's great surfing, and also lots and lots of marine biomass. So as legend goes, I'm getting this like third and fourth hand from my graduate advisor's graduate advisor. So there was an event that had happened in the early 60s in Santa Cruz, which is in Central California. It was the middle of the night. And what the folks of Santa Cruz had noticed is they started to hear funny noises outside their houses and on their lawns. When they went out to check out what was happening, there were seabirds like crashing into their windows and slamming into their cars and flopping around on their lawns, exhibiting some very significant neurological pathology. So they wrote a newspaper article about it. It turns out, again, as the legend goes, we have to have a claim to fame. Again, like I said, we're very insecure. As legend goes, there, it was madness. But according to those who were there, apparently Alfred Hitchcock lived in this place called Scotts Valley, which is the next town over from Santa Cruz. During that event, called up the newspaper reporter, yada, yada, yada. We got the movie The Birds. Anyway, but that fictional event that the book and the movie were based on was actually very closely related to a real event that had all kinds of signs retrospectively, hindsight is 2020, that looked like intoxication from a harmful algal bloom. And it wasn't until several decades later that someone actually was able to find archived water samples from the 60s and able to confirm that, yes, this was a harmful algal bloom related event. So the harmful algal critter in question was a diatom, a phytoplankton called Pseudonychia, this long spindly critter, right, that you see here. This is an SEM image of that guy. Produces a molecule called domoic acid, which is a neurotoxin. It interferes with neuronal transmission, how neurons talk to each other, and is concentrated by a vector organism. Remember we said vector organisms are filter-feeding organisms? That's really where bivalve shellfish shine. They are sort of the primo filter-feeding organism. They take in huge amounts of water. They're feeding on phytoplankton, so they just suck in huge amounts of water, filter out the plankton, send the seawater out the other side, and now they've got a nice free meal just by being a little marine Roomba, right? Unfortunately, all that domoic acid also gets concentrated in their tissues. So for decades, the blue mussel has been sort of the marine sentinel species, or the vector species that people look at and watch for incoming evidence of potentially harmful algal blooms to shellfish resources. They can also, again, any filter-feeding organism can do this, can accumulate in the bodies of small planktivorous fish, which are plankton-eating fish, like your anchovy, your sardine, your menhaden. These are every bit as efficient at filtering out and concentrating toxins as your bivalve shellfish are. All right, so the way domoic acid is the first one that really got our start as a scientific community looking at harmful algal blooms. It is a toxin because it works, its shape, the shape of the molecule is just like the shape of a molecule called glutamate. Glutamate is one of the receptors that your brain uses to talk to each other. You guys ever heard of MSG? That's glutamate, all right? So glutamate is just a receptor. If it gets on your tongue, it makes things taste meaty, right? It's where the sense of umami comes from. But it's just a way that you have one neuron and it shoots a little neurotransmitter to the second one that continues to relay a message. That's basically how neurons work for a sloppy way. So here's a neuron on the top talking to the neuron on the bottom by shooting little glutamates at it. So that's how neurons communicate. So the way domoic acid just throws a monkey wrench in this entire thing is domoic acid is shaped just like glutamate is. So in order for one neuron to talk to another, you have neuron one shoot that glutamate receptor out, the other one's got to catch it, right? But it has to catch it with a glove that is shaped exactly like the glutamate is, right? There has to be a match between the shape of, we call that a receptor, the catching part, and the neurotransmitter, the shooting part. If the shape doesn't match, then they don't send that signal, right? So domoic acid is shaped almost exactly like glutamate. So it catches and is caught by that glutamate receptor, but that receptor, that glove, does not want to let it go, which is a big problem if the second neuron is trying to send a message like flex your bicep muscle or send an information packet to another part of your brain. If it keeps sending that signal over and over and over again, that cell's gonna poop out and die, and then you get cell death, neuronal death, right? So we call that excitotoxicity. The result of that constant, uncontrolled transmission from one neuron to another can cause lots of things depending on what that second neuron is connected to. So for example, if that neuron is connected to your GI tract, it can cause nausea because it's causing things to move around and clench and contract and secrete things when it's not supposed to be. Cause nausea, can cause vomiting. If that second neuron is connected to your skeletal muscles, the things that cause you to move and move your body around, that can cause seizures, right? Uncontrolled, unuseful contractions of muscles are seizures. If it's connected to the memory parts of your brain, sometimes memories don't work and are not stored correctly, in which case you get memory loss, which is actually where we get the name of the human illness that this toxin causes, amnesic shellfish poisoning. So binding to that neuron, not letting it stop sending that transmission causes all kinds of secondary effects, depending on which part of the body it connects to. So the reason we even know about this is because I don't know if you guys know this about people from California, but they really love their sea lions. I mean, they really, really love their sea lions. So in 1998, there was a big, again, one of these pretty seasonal pseudonychia blooms, and all the huge amounts of domoic acid that it produced came along with that. Occurred in Monterey Bay. You could actually see the bloom from space using satellites. So all that domoic acid that was concentrated in their food started to make their way into the sea lions, and they started to have lots and lots of neurological issues, and they actually started to die. There were several hundred animals died in the space of maybe 7 or 8 weeks. And again, Californians noticed this immediately, and it was a very, very big deal. There was a huge amount of DA, or domoic acid, in these sea lions. However, there was none in the shellfish, right? The shellfish, which was supposed to be the go-to organism to track early warning signs of domoic acid, failed. So ever since then, we as a community sort of look at multiple different types of species as early warning marine sentinel species since then. So the impacts that it had on these critters were pretty diverse. Sea lions, which they can be pretty friendly, but normally they aren't super buddy-buddy with humans, lost all fear of, or the ones that were really highly intoxicated with this toxin lost all fear of humans. This one ended up on the back of a California Highway Patrol car, so they named him Chippy. I don't know if you guys remember the show Chips. Yes, named after those chips. They found one like 100 miles inland in an artichoke field. There's all kinds of other things that abnormal behaviors is what I'm trying to say. So when they wanted to figure out like what was going on inside the brains of these animals that was causing them to act this way as a result of that domoic acid intoxication. So what they wanted to do was, well, we gotta look inside there. We have this really cool thing called a MRI machine or a CT scanner. Like, great, how are you gonna make that work on a sea lion? It's like, well, it turns out if you know somebody who works at the hospital, you can sneak a sea lion in the back door of the hospital and stick it in an MRI machine and scan its brain. You're very well connected. So that is exactly what they did. What they looked at was the first images of MRI scans of marine mammal brain. This is what it's supposed to look like on the top right. This is a normal hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of your brain where a lot of things go on there, but it's one of the places where memory, short-term memory, is stored. What you can see here is a nice kind of solid white image. White means there are living cells there. Dark means there's fluid, which means there were cells there, but now there are not. So cell death is what you're noticing is atrophy in parts of the brain that should be in control of aggression, memory, and some other neurological things. So we started to see actual evidence of cell death and brain damage from domoic acid. That was the first event. Almost every year or every couple of years since then, we've noticed recurrent domoic acid blooms, and also starting to affect more species than just our sea lion. We're starting to see it in dolphins and whales and porpoises, even down to sea otters. Every couple of years, we'll see a large-scale marine mortality event, and lots of times these mortality events are caused by domoic acid intoxication. There are some other chronic and long-term effects aside from just dying flat out. You can also have over years and years of constant exposure. This is a seasonal event. Again, the problem, what makes this especially harmful is this is a springtime event. When the waters warm up and all the nutrients are available, then the same way that flowers bloom in spring, harmful algal blooms also bloom in spring, which also happens to be the time when sea lion moms are just about to give birth. So they have nearly full-term fetuses, which are very, very neurologically sensitive. They can have disproportionate amount of damage can happen to a fetus than a full-grown adult because it's not fully cooked yet, right? So if you're getting low-level, non-fatal exposure into the mom, the amount of damage that it does to the mom is very minimal, but the amount of damage that can happen to the uterus sometimes can be fatal. So you can see huge numbers of aborted pups, reproductive failure, loss in the amount of pups that are produced in that year because of that in utero exposure. And this can actually have long-term effects, what we call it chronic epileptic syndrome. So you tend to have seizures for no reason throughout the course of the life, just from that single in utero exposure. So it has lots of long-term population effects in addition to just flat out killing them outright. All right, so a little bit closer to home, when we were talking about Florida red tide, Florida red tide is caused by a toxin called brevetoxin. And brevetoxin is caused by a dinoflagellate species called Karenia brevis. This guy in the top right is a dinoflagellate. It's got two little flagella. One sticks out the bottom, one goes around the waist. Cute little guy, if you didn't know any better. So this is the one that causes all the fun times if you go to visit the beach during a red tide. All the respiratory irritation. This poor lifeguard has to wear a mask out on the beach. But this is one is, again, dark brown. Again, this is why red tide isn't called red tide. Dark brown tide and green tide just doesn't do the same justice. So we call it a harmful algal bloom. But brevetoxin is our local version that we're probably going to be most familiar with as Florida citizens. So Karenia, the causative organism, it's always around. It's there all the time, year round. And so the harmful algal blooms that are caused by the Florida red tide organism, Karenia, on average, it hits about every year, especially if you live on the central west coast. Just about every year, you're likely to get at least one bloom. We have, fortunately for us as East Coast, Florida East Coasters, it's way less often, maybe once every 10, 15 years or so. But brevetoxin also is a neurotoxin. So it acts on the way that neurons communicate with each other. If you remember from physiology class, the way that neurons work is they let sodium in and they let potassium out, and it causes this wave, kind of like if you're, the ball game, everyone does the wave. Anyway, that's the way neurons talk to each other. The things that allow all those ions to come into the cell are called receptors. But brevetoxin, just like domoic acid, finds that receptor and sticks in it and doesn't come off, which basically tells the neuron, hey, you're not allowed to send any more signals, so you are shut off, you are silenced, you are muted. So anything that neuron connects to is not going to work right. So we call that a voltage-gated sodium channel activator for those of you who want to nerd. The way, if that neuron if it's connected to your guts, you're going to have nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea. If it's connected to skeletal muscles, you're going to have difficulty controlling your muscles and moving around. We call that ataxia. So not being able to move, not being able to have a decent meal without having your body freak out, that's neurotoxic shellfish poisoning, which is the human illness associated with brevetoxin. So it can be a big problem for fish. So in the same way that fish need their gills in order to absorb oxygen, it's also a very sensitive part of the body that's directly exposed to the outside world, the environment. So if you're a plankton-eating fish, you have these little tiny spindly bones that are right next to your gills that are basically acting like a filter that allow you to eat lots and lots of plankton. Basically acts like a little sieve. The plankton are caught on the gill rakers, and you get a nice big gulp of plankton. Unfortunately, Karenia brevis is a very, very fragile organism. Lots of other organisms have sort of a hard casing on them or a hard shell. This is what we call a naked dinoflagellate. It's just made out of little weak membranes. So any type of mechanical disturbance can cause it to just break open. They're that wimpy, right? So just the process of being brought over and suctioned across these gill rakers can cause these cells to lyse or to break open, and all that nice brevetoxin that was inside the cell now leaks out and is now outside the cell and is now free to cross into the bloodstream of the fish, which is a problem if you imagine how much more effective a toxin is if it's allowed to go directly into your bloodstream. So that's what happens with fish. I've heard stories of fishermen who are out fishing, and you guys. You know what a live well is in a boat? Like you kick some fish and you put it in a little box in your boat, and water is able to flow in and out of that box freely as you're going along to catch more fish. There's anecdotal reports of fishermen with a live well just full of fish, and they accidentally drive through a patch of red tide, and all those fish die within minutes. So direct absorption through the gills can cause individual fish to die. It's also where we get these giant fish kills that cause the fish to wash up on the beaches during a red tide. For humans, it's also a big deal for us because we like to go to the beach. The beach is great, especially if you live in Florida. There's lots and lots of beach. Another thing that happens with this wimpy little cell, Karenia brevis, is any type of mechanical sort of disturbance can cause it to break open. So the thing about brevetoxin is it's lipophilic, or it's lipid soluble, which means it doesn't like to be dissolved in water. It likes to go with lipids and fats and oils instead, all right? So we call that hydrophobic or lipophilic. So if you get something like Carina brevis in the surf zone, where there's constant pounding and churning, all these cells are going to break open. All that intracellular toxin becomes extracellular, and it doesn't like being in the water, so it's going to want to find some place else to go. It turns out the surface of bubbles, which are plentiful in the surf zone, are hydrophobic surfaces, all right? So they just stick to those like magnets to metal. And also what's going to happen in the surf zone, all those bubbles are lighter than water, so they're going to go straight up to the surface. So now you've got this brevetoxin encrusted bubble moving its way to the surface, and what happens when it gets to the surface? It breaks, and now you've weaponized this brevetoxin, and now becomes an aerosol. So it's now part of the airborne component, and anyone who is near the beach, when the sun is out, the water heats up, or the sand heats up, you get an onshore sea breeze, which acts as a vacuum to bring all of that aerosolized airborne brevetoxin to where your nose and face and lungs are. So that's normally not a big deal unless you have COPD or have some sort of chronic asthmatic effect, or you have some sort of lung issues. It exacerbates it. It makes your current existing conditions much, much worse. So all the coughing and wheezing and sneezing that you would be normally doing at home, it's times 10. Manatees live really close to the water. They're constantly breathing that air, that thin surface of air that rests just on the water. That's chock full of brevetoxin in its aerolized form. So they also get a big thick dose of brevetoxin, which we get lots and lots of manatee and dolphin-related mortality events. So over the last couple of decades, we've had at least 10 or 11 since this was, I put together this talk. It moves up through the food web. Sometimes it can adhere to the hydrophobic surfaces of seagrasses, and all the critters that eat the seagrasses also concentrate them. The result is the same thing: illness and death in large marine mammals. And finally, the one, so if any of you are from New England, this is the one that has probably kept you from eating shellfish when you want to go eat shellfish and go get your chowder. So in state of Maine is chock full of shellfish fishermen, and the organism that they hate the most is Alexandrium funiense. This is another dinoflagellate that produces another neurotoxin called saxitoxin, and saxitoxin is a critter responsible for paralytic shellfish poisoning. So the way that works, very similar: sticks to the neuron, prevents the neuron from talking. If that neuron is connected to your guts, it's going to cause GI distress. If it's connected to, this one is the reason it's called paralytic shellfish poisoning, in addition to causing tingling, the tingling, this is where it's going to come from. If that neuron is one of the ones that's sensing information about your body, sensing touch and taste and smell, it's going to cause numbness and tingling. It's going to cause that neuron, the same way if your arm goes numb, you can't really feel it. When the feeling comes back, it starts to tingle. That's partial paralysis. Same thing is happening here, paralysis of neurons. Also, but more importantly, if that neuron is connected to skeletal muscles, it's going to cause muscle paralysis. The most important skeletal muscle of all is your diaphragm. So if your diaphragm doesn't work, you can take a breath, or you can let your breath out, but that's the last breath you're going to take if your diaphragm doesn't work. So it causes respiratory paralysis and death by respiratory failure. In extreme cases, right? I don't want to put anyone off shellfish. That's a lie. I want to put everyone off shellfish, but that's this mechanism of action. So again, it's always been a human health risk, which is why there's tons and tons of shellfish monitoring agencies all across New England to keep us safe. For those of us who are, for one reason or another, just can't leave their shellfish alone. But so shellfish closures are a thing that is actually been the cause of federal disaster relief for Maine fishermen, because it's so widespread. It can affect marine mammals, not nearly as much as we see obvious effects from domoic acid and brevetoxin, but there was a large humpback whale mortality event in Cape Cod in the late 80s where all these whales were seen frolicking and jumping as normal, and then about 90 minutes later they got into a patch of sand lance that had a bunch of saxitoxin in them, and they were no longer. So it can have significant effects. And then here at home, we also have tons and tons of harmful algal blooms. As Floridians, we have, I don't know if we should be proud of this or not, way more harmful algal blooms than most other states. Pyrodinium is one of the ones that we should is sort of an up-and-comer, not really one that has had huge issues yet, but we do have annual blooms of this critter called Pyridinium bahamense. You probably have seen it if you've ever done one of these bioluminescent kayaking tours. Again, I'm trying not to be the harbinger of doom here. Don't go out and have any fun ever again. If you go to the Mosquito Lagoon and you take one of these kayaks, and if there's a new moon or the moon hasn't come out yet, it's absolutely the most beautiful thing you'll ever see in the natural environment, hands down. It's the coolest thing I've ever seen. They glow, they bioluminesce when they're disturbed. That's just what they do. Like you can see in this totally not photoshopped photo. However, they also produce a little bit of saxitoxin, which is why we're starting to research them as an organism of concern. They're not really causing shellfish closures and illness yet, but they do produce the same toxin that causes the same kind of nerve dysfunction and the same paralytic, in theory, the same of paralytic shellfish poisoning, which is why now we're starting to monitor shellfish beds in the Indian River Lagoon, just in case it turns out to be as big a deal as it is in New England. Anyway, the question you're probably asking yourself is this a concern for Indian River Lagoon animals? Are they being exposed to saxitoxin? If so, how much? The food web is very complicated. It's something we're just barely starting to look at as researchers in our field. We don't really have any answers yet, so yeah, probably some, I don't know how much, but some of the work we're doing, I'll probably skip these last few slides, some of the work we're doing is trying to answer those questions, is what is the amount of toxins that we can find in the Indian River Lagoon by itself? How much do those toxins transmit and are moving through the food web, and into which species? Can we see it in fish? Can we see it in bivalves? And can we see it in the organisms that feed on those important species? Can we see it in manatees and dolphins and other large-scale or large predators? So just some of the research that we've been looking at with collaboration with the Georgia Aquarium. We've done some health assessment, which is basically like a veterinary checkup that you do for dolphins. You set a net around them and hold them in place while the vets do all their things to them, and then you let them go, give them a clean bill of health. We have found small amounts of saxitoxin on these critters, but from the little we know, this is probably asymptomatic. So it is there, and as is the case for a lot of harmful algal bloom toxins, our methods of detection are so sensitive, we can pretty much detect it anywhere now. So lest you be concerned if you hear the words, we detected a toxin in the water. It's not concerning unless it's at a significant level or an area to cause, a level to cause harm. So yeah, we are starting to see it everywhere, but I think it's just because we're looking everywhere and we have really, really good tools. And I think that's sort of the trend that a lot of harmful algal bloom research is going. Yeah, anywhere you look, you're gonna find it now. But now the more important question is, what sort of significant health impacts is it having or is it expected to have, and should we be concerned? So that's pretty much all I have prepared for you guys. I would love to take any questions. This is kind of my main interest and my main specialty. Thank you again for coming, and I'll take any questions. Sorry for the frogginess of my voice. Yes, sir, here in the front.
I'm from up north, and we know that you eat shellfish, especially oysters,
Right.
in
In With
November, December.
Oh.
October. Down here, they say, oh, no problem, you can eat them all year long. How come?
So again, that's why so the question was, we don't eat shellfish in months that end with So November, October, and December.
The only months you can.
Oh, those are the only months you can't. All right, so what I would say to that is your best bet is to pay strict attention to the agencies that are in charge of monitoring those shellfish, because the harmful algal blooms don't care what the month ends in. They can't read. Usually, and kind of to answer your question, typically they're seasonal, which means sometimes they're not, right? So typically it's a spring thing. When the waters warm up, waters are calmer, nutrients are more available, brought to the surface, so there's more food for them to eat, they grow more. There can be a lot of other oceanographic factors that can cause a particular algae to bloom outside of season. It's happened before and it's gonna happen again. So great rule of thumb, if you're going for the avoiding part, also avoid any shellfish that are available when the FDA says not to eat them. That'd be my recommendation. Does that answer your question? All right. Yes, sir, over here.
Is there any research or study into remedying the toxicities? I mean, is there a cure for them?
The question was, are there any remedies for the toxicity or the cure? So in some cases, yeah, so for domoic acid, it's the one we kind of have known about for the longest because that was sort of our first experience as science nerds to harmful algal bloom toxins. So there are a lot of marine mammal rehabilitation centers all up and down the Pacific coast, especially in California, which is kind of ground central for domoic acid intoxication. So I work with a lot of veterinarians, like at the Marine Mammal Center, who take in stranded animals that look like they are stranded because of domoic acid intoxication, and they try to rehabilitate them and get them healthy again and then re-release them. So a lot of the, most of the treatment that goes into that is just taking care of symptoms. There's not really something you can cure, you just wait for it to clear from your system, keep the animals alive, keep them happy until your own body is able to process and depurate the toxins. For the most part, for marine mammals, which are, again, somewhat difficult to treat since we know so very little about them, that's usually the case. For humans, we have all kinds of ways of detecting and treating neurological symptoms, giving them care. For example, if it's respiratory failure type of toxin like saxitoxin, you can keep them on a ventilator until the body flushes that from the system. They have done that in some cases. In other cases, you can make sure that they have constant fluids. You're not going to be in the mood for eating if you've got gastrointestinal distress, so IV drips can sometimes replace lost water, lost nutrients while your GI tract is trying to reset itself. So there are some treatments, but it's mostly symptomatic for illness just until your body can get rid of it on its own. You got another question, follow up?
Primarily for gastro, or would it also be for something in the mind or the brain of the neural?
So the follow-up question was that for gastrointestinal, for neurological symptoms, it can be a bit of both. And in a lot of cases, it's just mostly, at least from what I've been told, this is secondhand, keeping the patient comfortable until they're able to get their liver and kidneys able to get rid of those toxins on their own, which they're constantly doing. So it's mostly just to keep them happy in a waiting game, keep them comfortable until their body can do its thing. Yeah. Yes, sir. Back in the back. The question was, I'm focusing on right now IRL based research, but am I going to focus on the St. Lucie estuary? We actually, shortly after I got here at Florida Tech, we were working with a grant to look at a couple different species of harmful algal blooms in the IRL until the big Lake Okeechobee bloom gifted you guys with that nice microcystis bloom. So we sort of diverted some of our attention to looking at that toxin, which is called microcystin. So we've been spending the last several years trying to work out a detection method to detect that toxin in marine mammals and lots of other marine critters. The problem is we've been adapting a test that was mostly developed for people in the Great Lakes just looking at drinking water. We've had a little bit of difficulty getting it to work for the animal tissues, which are just dirty and gross and cause lots of complications. But to answer your question, yes, we are very, very interested. In fact, the last meeting, the National Harmful Algal Bloom meeting I went to, I can't remember the number of times that people started to say microcystin is now the sexy form of field research in the harmful algal bloom community, which is your guys' neck of the woods. So yeah, you guys are being talked about very much in the HAB community as sort of a new field of research, because that species, that microcystis species, should not be here. It's a freshwater species. It has no business belonging in a marine environment. So it's all new for us. So we've got more questions than you, I can guarantee.
And that's a good segue to one of our questions from our Zoom audience. You mentioned microcystis. Is there any new research on the impacts of BMAA on human health?
From the little I know, there are lots more questions, but it doesn't seem to be as much evidence for, at least reproducible evidence for having that to be something of concern, at least as something that is produced by IRL species. Again, my knowledge on this is very, very scarce, but there are a couple papers that I've looked at that have proposed it to be a toxin for concern, but I really know very little about it other than to say I haven't seen much traction besides a few sort of initial publications.
And another Zoom question: approximately how many cases per year are presented in hospitals where people get sick from exposure to some of these compounds?
I couldn't tell you a number, but I know that at least in there's a study that they did when I was a graduate student out working at Moe Marine Lab, where the folks from the NIEHS, National Institute something Health Services, were working with some of the folks at Moe Marine Lab to look at I believe it was the number of hospital admissions in Sarasota County. I want to say our number of hospital admissions for respiratory complaints, I think doubled or tripled during a red tide versus during normal time. So it does have a very immediate and measurable impact. I can't tell you actual numbers. I just know it's from a little to a lot. Yes, sir, right.
Have harmful algal blooms been found to affect the North Atlantic right whales?
Have harmful algal blooms been known to affect North Atlantic right whales? That's a good question. Some former coworkers of mine had that same question, I think in the early 2000s. What they were able to do were, this is actually kind of a funny story. They wanted to know, first of all, if the toxin was present in their diet. So they were able to find significant amounts of saxitoxin, as well as a little bit of domoic acid in copepods, which are these small animal-like plankton that right whales graze on. So that was pretty well established that it is there in their food web. Whether it affects them individually, it's hard to tell unless you know what the behavioral symptoms of that intoxication look like in a whale. Then you really have no idea of looking behaviorally. In terms of mortality, I don't think it's been shown to affect mortality, though. The way they got those samples is kind of a funny story. There's you guys know those, so they use fecal samples, so poop samples from white whales. Turns out they float on the water. You guys ever seen, those drug sniffing dogs, the one with the sniff the bombs and the drugs? They actually train one of those to sniff out right whale poop. So they give him a little life jacket and they stick him on the prow of the boat, and he's pointing the researchers towards the right whale poop, which is one of the best or one of the worst jobs I can think of. But the short answer to the answer is no, we don't know yet. The levels that they found on their food, I think they were significant, but there's really no way, unless you know what normal right whale behavior looks like, to be able to identify abnormal right whale behavior. It's an excellent question. I wish I knew the answer as well. Yeah. Yes, here, right in the front.
What animal is the bioluminescence toxic to?
The what animal is the bioluminescence toxic to? Bioluminescence itself is completely harmless. But that critter that produces the bioluminescence also produces a little bit of this toxin. We don't know if that's a huge amount of toxin. We don't know if it's a tiny amount of toxin yet. We're just barely starting to look at it, but it's concerning to us just because we know that same toxin in other places is a big problem. So we're trying to find out, is it also a problem here? Yeah. Yes, ma'am, right here in the front.
So when the algae blooms happen in the ocean, and the algae ocean they go to children, do they get, and does it still harm the algae ocean, like the children when the algae blooms happen in the ocean?
So the question was, when harmful algal blooms happen in the ocean, does it also harm the alligators in Lake Okeechobee? I don't know, but I doubt it, because usually the water is moving, in almost all cases, moving from freshwater places to ocean environments. And there's really I think the only place I know where it moves in the other direction is the St. Johns River, and that's only some time. So I would probably say that the alligators are safe from the marine harmful algal blooms, but there's plenty of other stuff in the freshwater environment to keep them busy. Yes, sir.
I understand that type of algae that looks like spilled blue paint in the water is toxic. Can you tell me what the harmful effects of that kind of algae could be?
The question was the type of algae that looks like spilled blue paint?
Yeah.
Is that blue-green algae, which is actually, oddly enough, a cyanobacteria. So that's why we kind of lump them together into algae. So bacteria can also produce some of these same toxins. Cyanobacteria, as a matter of fact, Microcystis, the one that produces microcystin, the one that came from Lake Okeechobee into the estuary here, that's also cyanobacteria. although I don't think it's bioluminescent. But I'm not sure which species that refers to, because bioluminescence is pretty common, characteristic amongst all kinds of different species of phytoplankton. But like I said, bioluminescence by itself is totally harmless, but any number of organisms can have either a known toxin or a toxin that we're still looking into. But to answer your question, I'm not sure if that's one that I've seen a lot of identifiable.
Spencer, I think he's asking about microcystis.
Are you acting?
Yeah, when it starts to die in a marine environment, it gets this real bright blue hue to it. So I think that's
it does.
probably the specific one he's asking about.
Yeah, so that doesn't have to wait till it's dead in order to be harmful. So as long as it's a healthy organism, it's producing that toxin. But when it dies, sometimes it can even be worse. So sometimes phytoplankton researchers, particularly HAB researchers, will usually use the term intracellular versus extracellular, or talk about the age of the bloom. So in an early bloom, in a young bloom, you have all the healthy cells that are keeping that toxin inside their cells. But as the bloom ages and cells just start to poop out and die, then they all start to break open. And what would otherwise be kept and sequestered inside the cells now dissolved in the seawater, which makes it much more mobile. So sometimes how long the bloom has been around can drastically affect its impacts on the marine environment. Does that answer your question? Okay.
And we have actually a great follow-up to that question from one of our Zoom viewers. Well, I thought we can eat blue-green algae. I guess thinking about something like chlorella or spirilla.
Well, again, like I said, it all depends on the species. If you actually look at the number of toxin-producing microalgae versus the non-toxic, I think it's really only maybe like 2% of all phytoplankton species are known to be toxic. So in most cases, they're just a normal, harmful, naturally occurring part of the phytoplankton community. It's just those 2% that we worry about and their impacts. But for most cases, you're totally fine. It's like walking in the grass. Maybe you have that one weird blade of grass that's going to poke you, but for the most part, don't give them a bad rap.
So folks, we're just about out of time. We'll see if we can maybe take one or two more questions here from the library, and I'll try to grab one more off of our Zoom audience.
Yes, ma'am, in front.
Okay, right now, Lego is 16 feet. That means they're gonna be draining it soon.
Uh-oh.
Is there a bloom going on the lake now?
The question is there a bloom occurring in Lake Okeechobee right now? I'm not sure. I don't really follow Lake Okeechobee. I'm unfortunately primarily a marine scientist, so anything happening in the freshwater environment, I'm a complete noob at, and so I only get secondhand from freshwater scientists. But I'm not sure. Maybe someone else.
Yeah, I could speak to that quickly. Right now, there is not. Normally, those blooms occur in the summertime, but last year we were all shocked to see the bloom appear in late February. So our very first signs of a microcystis bloom last year were months earlier than we would expect, and that's our big concern now. Is with a warming climate and all the rain we're getting this year from the El Nino climate pattern, that we may see the microcystis blooms that typically occur in July, August, and September starting earlier and earlier in the year, and they may coincide with periods of discharge from the lake. So it's something that we're going to keep our eye on. We'll update you when it happens.
One more? Yes, sir.
It's a little different environment, but I'm worried about the impact of HABs on open feeding salmon, like sockeye salmon. They're from the smolt, they go out there maybe 3 or 4 years out in the ocean, and they work their way back to where they were born to spawn, but they're filter feeders, and then going out and setting that.
So the question is, you're concerned about the effects of harmful algal blooms on sockeye salmon because they are filter feeding organisms. I haven't heard a lot in the literature about impacts on salmon, but if you look at how much of the marine environment we are actually able to monitor and be aware of changes, it's a very small fraction. So the fact that salmon are spending, again, a large part of their time upriver, where there's not a lot of monitoring going on, and sometimes offshore, both of those places are places that are not really where marine scientists tend to look. The odd aquatic freshwater scientists may look upstream, but anytime you go offshore, that's really that's sort of a dead zone. It's a dark zone for us. If we can't see it by satellite and we can't visually observe it at the coast or collect physical samples from it, then we know very, very little about it. But again, like I said, any place that you're going to find a large, dense bloom that has that toxin, it's going to be possible. But at least in the literature, I haven't heard a lot of significant impacts on salmon populations, fortunately.
And we're going to wrap up with one last question from our Zoom audience. This is kind of a neat one. Are there any organisms that can eat or metabolize the algal toxins opportunistically as a food source?
The toxins themselves, I'm not sure. There are lots of, a huge amount of effort is being put into mitigation strategies, so ways that we can not really prevent, or not, excuse me, not really cure, but deal with the impacts better. For example, and a lot of those are involved in the aquaculture or the fish farming industry. For example, if you get a big fish farm and you get a harmful algal bloom rolling in, you may lose your entire crop of however many millions of fish overnight. So one of the genius researchers I'm working with in the chemistry department of Florida Tech, his name's Dr. Tawfiq Reza. He is a chemist, and we're working together on a few grants to look at using biochar. It's basically like activated charcoal. You know how if you swallow poison, sometimes you have activated charcoal to be able to neutralize those poisons. There's a similar process that can go on for any type of organic material that's been cooked or baked to be like charcoal, that has a very high attraction to both the toxins as well as the cells that produce them, to get them to sort of sink out of the water column. So we're working on a couple different projects to see how effective that biochar is, to be able to look at multiple species of harmful algal blooms, to be able to get them out of the water and also sort of sequester and remove those toxins from the food web so they're not available to other critters.
All right, folks, I know we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but our time is up, so please help me give Spencer a big thank you.
Thank you.
And we're pretty close to the end of our evening tonight, so if you could help me out, we need to get out of the library in the next like 3 or 4 minutes. If you could make your way outside, I appreciate it. I didn't want to stop us, though. We had so many great questions. Please join us next week. We're going to have a fantastic presentation all about horseshoe crabs. Bring a friend, bring a neighbor, bring somebody who loves horseshoe crabs, and we'll see you again in a week. Thanks, everybody.